We are so back, Final Fantasy bros. And is it really that surprising? By this point in history, which was the early 90s, the mainline Final Fantasy games had made the jump from the NES to the Super Nintendo over here in the West, and just about everything involving Final Fantasy IV, or Final Fantasy II as we knew it back then, was just bigger and better. We had bigger worlds, bigger storylines, better graphics, better characters, and really just the whole ball of wax was bigger and better. Starting off with Final Fantasy IV's story, we're first introduced to a third overarching Crystal story. So yeah, we've seen this song and dance twice before already, and admittedly it's maybe not immediately all that interesting, but the story corrects itself pretty quickly. And it does so by holding no punches back and requires you as the player controlling our main protagonist Cecile Harvey to commit an act of terrorism in the first 20 minutes. And not only that, but now enemies are no longer going to allow you to sit there and meticulously plan each of your turns out. No, they're going to act whether you're ready or not. So say hello to the active time battle, or the ATB. So between forcing the player to commit an act of terrorism and now a new sense of urgency added to even just the regular trash mob battles, it's clear that this ain't your daddy's Final Fantasy anymore. In that same sense, Final Fantasy IV's narrative is certainly more mature and developed than its predecessors, and to this day, over 30 years later, the game is still heralded as one of Final Fantasy's best, and I will say I do agree with that sentiment. I mean, the story in particular is very character-centric, and I appreciate Cecile's transformation and growth, but there are some shortcomings, such as the love triangle that involves Cecile, Kain, and Rosa. It just feels a bit tired, and I would say it's just sort of there as window dressing to add additional conflict between our rivals Cecile and Kain without being anything especially interesting. That said, though, Final Fantasy IV's story was very complex for its era, and there's something very real and harrowing about the futility of Cecile and the team's efforts to thwart the Kingdom of Baron's expansionist tyranny, and for our heroes to basically fail at every single turn except in the ending, of course. So it's hard not to feel invested in Final Fantasy IV's main cast as they continuously struggle with redemption and acceptance in an increasingly hostile world, and even the secondary characters like Yang are really cool and add a lot of background to the ongoing story. But Final Fantasy IV is not without its faults. Most of my complaints about the game lie with the gameplay itself, chiefly that combat can be very frustrating at times because you never get to pick which party members are present in the narrative at any given time because the game is so story-driven, so there are definitely a few moments too many where you need magic casters and instead you're stuck with largely a physical team or vice versa. It's never really a game stopper, but it's definitely pretty annoying when it happens. I should also note that Final Fantasy IV is just generally a hell of a lot harder than the previous three installments, and not only because of the ATB system, but because enemies just hit harder in general, and because jobs are limited to the characters themselves, as I just said a few moments ago, there's definitely a few times during the course of the game where you have to have someone be a backup healer or be a backup tank, and they're not really suited for it all that well. Another example of some old and bad game design that Final Fantasy IV features are that some of the dungeons require the costly float spell to be cast on each party member and repeatedly, so it becomes extremely tedious. We're also still doing the whole boss rush, boss rematch thing, which I have rarely appreciated in games because I think I can count on one hand the number of times it's been done well and it's not managed in a way that just feels like it's complete developer laziness. But truthfully, most of these faults can also be levied against the previous three games, and honestly, I would chalk them up to just being more emblematic of the 90s RPG medium back then, and it's even still hard to deny that all the subsequent mid-modern Final Fantasy games, and even most of the modern Final Fantasy games, took note of what Final Fantasy IV did well, and tried to replicate the formula either in whole or in part. Whether that was the grand story, the combat, the advent of major cutscenes, and most notably the emphasis upon the humanization of the characters. So, said another way, Final Fantasy IV is the game that really just set the rest of the Final Fantasy series in motion. In the end, while this pixel remaster version isn't the best version of Final Fantasy IV, it's still very good, and it only asks players for about 15 to 20 hours of their time, which is quite modest all things considered. Still, even this version illustrates just how well the original Final Fantasy IV still holds up after all these long years, earning it a B+/A-. Hold on to your Barts, because Final Fantasy V is next.